Hi, I'm Richard Vague with Tycos. Is President Trump pilfering the Reagan playbook? When Reagan took office in January of 1981, on the strength of a campaign whose slogan was, get this, quote, "Let's make America great again," he inherited massive inflation and very high interest rates from his predecessor, Jimmy Carter, who in fact had lost the election in part because of that inflation and those interest rates. At that moment, Reagan and much of the conservative political world were under the sway of the self-assured and compelling economist Milton Friedman. Friedman's view was that inflation had resulted from high spending and thus high money supply growth, and the way to cure that inflation was through high interest rates, which would act to slow down money supply growth. The liberal Jimmy Carter had actually appointed the economically conservative Paul Volcker, a follower of Friedman's theories, to the position of Fed chairman to succeed the beleaguered William Miller, the man blamed for rampant inflation, falsely in my view. Faced with a monthly annualized inflation rate that had reached over 15% in May of '79, Miller had already jacked up interest rates from a low of 4.65% in early 1977 to 12.16% in September of 1979, which was the point at which Paul Volcker took over. But inflation was actually still getting worse, and Volcker, faced with a monthly annualized inflation rate of over 18.25% in March of 1980, oversaw a rise in interest rates to the eye-popping, draconian rate of 19.85%, viewed as a stronger and necessary dose of economic medicine. Well, these high rates brought on a recession in the middle of 1980, no surprise. GDP growth flattened from 3.9% in the summer of 1978 to 0.11% in the summer of 1979, then plummeted to negative 2.1% in 1980. High rates, high prices, and slow economic growth throughout Carter's term led to a feeling of economic uncertainty that played a major factor in stock market valuation. In fact, in just those 4 years, the stock market remained in the desultory range it had been in for most of the decade and saw 3 corrections of 10% or more. And despite the recession of 1980, the Fed's actions and the prospect of a Reagan victory, the circumstances pointed very strongly towards a Reagan victory, gave investors hope that inflation would fall and the economy would bounce back, resulting in a stock market recovery of 38% by the time of the election in November of 1980. Interest rates had even briefly come down to 9.93% in July of 1980, but on the eve of the election, as voters went into the voting booths, they stood at 13.77%. It was a Reagan landslide with a final count of 489 electoral votes for Reagan and only 49 for Carter. In early 1981, when Reagan took office, monthly annualized inflation was in the range of 9 to 12%, rates set at 17.25%, and growth had turned positive but was still at a weak 1.96%. So Reagan basically found himself saddled with high inflation, high rates, and low growth. Here's the interesting part. Reagan could have tried to browbeat Volcker into lower rates, but he and his advisors were convinced that high rates were in fact the correct prescription. And if they allowed those high rates to do their work in the earliest months of Reagan's first term, the economy would be cured and in great shape by the time he stood for re-election in 1984. Sure enough, Volcker's exorbitantly high rates brought another ugly GDP collapse in the summer of 1981, what you might call a double dip recession, with growth reaching a low of negative 1.55% in March of 1982. The stock market also seemed to feel the effects, declining 25% from November of 1980, the election month, to July of 1982. Around that same time, the Fed concluded that inflation was finally under control, and for the next 11 months, they would bring rates down all the way from 17% to 9%. Imagine that in the context of what we see today. It was, an 800 basis point decline. Of course, high rates had helped tame inflation. That's like using dynamite to dig a hole when there were other ways to successfully achieve lower inflation. In fact, what had worked, though most history books miss this, is that the deregulation of oil prices had spurred massive new U.S. drilling, which brought on a proverbial gusher of new oil, which caused the price of oil to drop from $39 a barrel in 1980 to $29 in early 1983, and eventually all the way down to $12 a barrel in 1986. That's a lot of relief. And of course, since this was joined by an 800 basis point reduction in rates, the economy started performing better. GDP turned positive again, rebounding from that grim recession to post 2.3% and 1.95% growth rates in 1983 and 84, respectively, which frankly is typical of a rebound from a negative growth rate. The stock market rejoiced, skyrocketing 56% from July of 1982 to June of 1983. And as if on cue, in 1984, Reagan used the now famous campaign slogan, quote, "It's morning again in America," to coast into a second term in office in an even greater landslide, winning 525 electoral votes to a mere 13 votes for the hapless Democrat Walter Mondale. So, a formula of sort was set. Take your medicine, take your economic medicine, and suffer the resulting economic pain early in your presidency, early in the first term of your presidency, so that things are good in time for your reelection campaign. Very simple. First pain, then gain. So what's the connection of all that to Trump and the economy of today? Simply this. Trump internalized this first pain, then gain playbook. But whereas for Reagan, the medicine was high rates, for Trump, the necessary medicine is tariffs and government spending cuts. Trump and his advisors have that formula firmly in mind as he has come right out of the electoral chute, inflicting pain he believes necessary onto the economy in the form of these tariffs and budget cuts. He and his advisors genuinely believe that it is the right medicine, and though it will bring pain, they are convinced that the reward will be a booming economy no later than 2027 and 2028. I mean, when you see Trump talking about how unconcerned he is about the bad news today and a potential recession, this is exactly what he's thinking about, this early pain, later gain formula. So he expects a booming economy in 27 and 28, when he self-reportedly will be making his play for a third term. For Trump, the only problem is that these tariffs and these federal budget cuts may not bring about the robust future that he believes they will. It may not be the right medicine. We'll explore that a bit in a future video. That's it for this week. Thanks.